Okay, I'm recording. So, do you want me to count us in, or should I just go for it?
Just go for it.
Okay, this is the counting in part.
Yeah, we have counted.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Sparking Connections. This week is a
Hello.
science episode, so you can hear my lovely voice. Today we're talking about endemic diseases of the UK and what endemic diseases actually mean and all that good stuff. So, Esmé, I love to start with a question. Do you know what an endemic disease is? Don't look. Don't look. You're gonna cheat. But do you know? Do you have any idea?
So I know that a pandemic is worldwide,
Mm-hmm.
and see now, okay, I'm not sure of the difference between epidemic and endemic, but
They are
the
different.
the N prefix I think means in. So within a country or an area, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's sort of, I would say it's a disease that is in the country at a regular level. It's not emerging. It's not a pandemic or an epidemic. It's emerged and it's here to stay for the most part, unless we
Okay.
eradicate it. But it's at regular levels. So it's defined from this article that I found as the prevalence of disease in a particular area over a long period of time.
Okay.
So it's here to stay for good. Can you think of any endemic diseases in the UK, just per chance?
I'm not aware of any that are specifically the UK. Like
Mm-hmm.
any disease that I could think of that exists in the UK, for all I know, it exists elsewhere. Like, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Well, it doesn't have to be exclusive.
Okay. So, like flu, that sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So influenza, common cold viruses, norovirus, adenovirus, and yeah, there's loads and loads of examples, and I've chosen a few to talk about in a little bit. But I just wanted to highlight that, like I say, it's not an emerging disease. It's one that's already emerged, because emerging would be like a sudden outbreak.
Okay.
And, you know, you're seeing a lot of countries that go through outbreaks of various things, particularly COVID at the moment, or SARS coronavirus 2, which is its official name. So we're seeing a lot of coronavirus emerging, but as it's around longer and longer, it starts to take on that status of being endemic.
Right. Okay.
So typically, if it's emerging, it's appeared where it hasn't before, or has been eradicated from and then returns. I don't know if there's necessarily an example of that. I guess re-emerging diseases in terms of like sexually transmitted diseases. And I
Oh
suppose
yeah.
we
Okay.
would count measles as a re-emerging disease in the UK.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, we'll get into that in a little bit. But there's also something quite interesting in terms of determining when a disease can become endemic. So it isn't
Okay.
just down to whether the disease appears or whatever the organism appears and infects people. It's actually related to the social aspect of that disease, and like the social aspect of whether people think it's acceptable to have that disease. For
Oh.
example, common cold, and this is something that's been really bothering me recently, especially related to, you know, people are scared that they have COVID or they have a cold. To me, I don't want to see you if you have either, right?
Hmm.
I don't want you to come to me and hang out when you have a cold, because I'm going to get that cold. But to
Yeah.
many, many people, it's very socially acceptable to particularly in the UK, to soldier through and be like, yeah, I have a cold, but it's fine. I can go to work. I can do this. But I'm like, no, don't come near me. Do not come near me if you have a cold. Like I say, my example is always when I was at uni, I'd be walking down the corridors. I'm a pretty short person. I've had people sneeze and cough on the back of my head. It's not nice. I don't want it.
It's
I don't
gross.
need it. It's disgusting. Wash your hands. As you can tell, as a microbiologist, I get very riled up about this. So, you have to weigh up, common colds do kill people, but it's not as common as other viruses, other bacteria. So therefore, in the public perception, and maybe, the public perception shapes the government's perception of a disease, doesn't matter. Those people, that number of deaths is acceptable. And that's really quite an interesting thing to talk about in terms of ethics. I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
I mean, obviously, my thought on that is that it's pretty terrible. You never know who has some kind of immunodeficiency or, some other condition that puts them more at risk.
Yeah.
And like, it's just ableist that that there isn't the same kind of infrastructure in place to deal with that, to prevent vulnerable people from becoming seriously ill from something that, for me, for example, wouldn't be an issue.
Right.
But it's what we're kind of seeing with COVID to some extent, that, people were saying, well, you're young and healthy, what does it matter to you? And it's like, well, it doesn't matter to me if I get COVID, but it does matter to me if I pass it on to somebody who's going to become much more seriously ill because of it. I'll be fine. Not everybody will be.
Right, exactly.
And it is sort of, it bothers me that people they only worry about it if they think it's a threat to themselves.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah, definitely. So obviously, like I said, how the public perceive a problem is usually how the government deals with that problem. So a lot of people are pushed through a cold and don't mind. Therefore, the government's not going to crack down on people having colds and make sure that everybody stays at home if they have a cold. But because people are so aware of coronavirus at the moment, the government really have to push to make sure that people are getting the treatment that they need and getting the social distance that they need. And yes, they're different viruses. They do have, coronavirus has a much more dangerous impact on the body, but the principles are pretty similar.
To be fair, also, like, it's not just that people will push through if they've got a cold, it's that they have to, that you can't, like, I mean, how many times, were we told at school that, you don't miss a day of school unless you're, like, actually sick.
Yeah,
and
totally.
Actually sick meant, vomiting or something serious.
Right, something you could see.
You had a cold. Yeah. I mean, when I was at school, I, was given certificates in assembly for 100% attendance. And it's like, it is sheer luck that I didn't get ill much and still don't get ill much. Like, there's no, if I had had a minor cold, that was directly encouraging me to go to school anyway.
Right, and then you'd get me sick. Who's part of the problem now?
Exactly, but like, and for work as well, you're not well to take time off for a minor,
well, sometimes you can't.
Illness.
Sometimes you're not paid to take that time off. And
exactly.
I feel like that certificate thing kind of brings back some memories, because I've never had 100% attendance because I have a chronic illness. I had to go to the hospital a lot. I was ill a lot. So, to me, it's completely ableist, because I'm like, I could have never achieved 100% attendance because I had appointments and things that I had to go to. So, it's definitely like built into our society, the way that we perceive disease. So therefore, that plays a huge part in how we view, like, the acceptance of endemicity, so diseases becoming endemic. Hang on for 1 sec, I'm just going to cough really, really loud. Yeah, I don't like that button's up there where you're hidden, because for you it must be just down the bottom. But anyway, so there's multiple phases of determining whether something becomes endemic. So the risk to the population, and therefore the public perception, and how likely you are to, quote unquote, soldier through this disease, and so on. But it also determines the level of intervention. So diseases can become endemic and still be, under treatment or vaccinated for or against, I suppose you'd call it against. So in terms of things like HIV, you can live a perfectly normal life, but you still have HIV. So it's endemic, but it doesn't. The intervention towards HIV means that you can live a normal life.
Right.
So with epidemics, obviously, the public response is a lot more immediate. So emerging diseases, there's on the news, you can see, and funding comes out of nowhere, and all this and all that means that there's an immediate response. And oftentimes it is because our healthcare system can't necessarily deal with an epidemic. The flu epidemic puts the hospitals out of commission every year because there's just not enough staff and beds to accommodate that many people. So they always encourage, stay at home if you can. Don't come into work if you have the flu, because you're going to make people who need to, who are immunocompromised and may need to go to the hospital. Fill up beds that aren't necessary. You just need to be careful for other people. And what we're seeing with COVID too. Same thing. And it also interrupts things that are quite important. So like routine vaccinations can be interrupted because people are like, don't come into the doctors unless you really, really need to. And sometimes people think, do I really, really need to get a vaccine? No, because there's no obvious effect. But the impact is really, really large, because that means large groups and large generations of people won't get vaccinated. You're also seeing a lot at the moment with cancer treatment due to COVID closing hospitals and stopping people from coming to hospitals. A lot of cancer patients who are immunocompromised aren't receiving treatment, can't go into hospital for consultations, and therefore their treatment is, being delayed or cancelled. And that's going to have a huge impact on a patient that has had long-term secondary cancer, because they need that regular treatment to keep the cancer down.
Yeah.
So I found a Houses of Parliament document on infectious diseases from 2017 that said infectious disease is 7% of deaths and £30 billion a year spending. That's what the impact of infectious disease is on the UK. That's pretty big.
Yeah.
So in terms of emerging or endemic, that amount of money is massive. So you can see that it's kind of preventing or predicting when an epidemic or when a disease might be up and coming becomes much more important when money and healthcare systems can't support. So usually something becomes endemic when the risk of that disease is perceived as low.
Yeah.
So like we talked about, colds, the risk for almost everyone, a large portion of the population, is pretty low. So then the people that are likely to get the colds are like, yeah, it doesn't really matter. The risk is low, so we allow it to continue in our population. But things like herpes and hepatitis, they're also endemic, but there are smaller clusters of people that want to have something done about them. So we talked about herpes before in terms of there's just now a cure for, or they're working on actioning a cure, a usable cure. And, that's not necessarily big news for everybody. That's not necessarily like, oh yeah, everybody look here, look there, there's a herpes cure in the works. Because it doesn't impact everybody. the risk is low for everybody except for those who have it, and then they're consciously thinking about it because they're like, how am I going to not spread it? How am I going to do this? How am I going to do that? So funding for those things is reduced, and the impact overall means that many people that have a disease that is endemic kind of get pushed to the side, not necessarily not treated, just, you know, there's not that huge push to eradicate the disease, and because it impacts a lot less people. The important thing to remember as well is to think back to our vaccination podcast. Eradication is the ideal. We want to eradicate everything, but endemicity, when things become endemic, proves that it's a lot harder than it looks, because again, the risk might be low, the perceived risk might be low, or people's perception of that disease, they might not care. So it may not seem like we have a lot of diseases in the UK. We're quite privileged really here around this place. There's a number of reasons why a lot of our diseases are kept to quite a low level of risk, or not, maybe not in the public awareness. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. And first and foremost is our free healthcare. You can go to the doctor and you can get treated. People aren't scared to get sick. They're like, oh, if I get sick, I get sick, and then go to the hospital and you know, you'll be fine. But then obviously public health in the UK can be, it's a coin of two sides. There's people that really support the healthcare system. There's really people that really hate the healthcare system. But there is a lot of controversy on, you know, deciding whether we should be relying on our free healthcare, whether it's doing the right thing, whether it's funding the right things. So that does play a part in controlling disease in the population. There's also a lot of disease in this country that isn't fatal to most people, or doesn't have as big of a impact in terms of symptoms. So we don't have things like malaria or cholera or dengue, which have very obvious symptoms. You know, dengue has joint pain that causes you to like seize up, and malaria has caused lots and lots of people to become really ill. And cholera, we know, is you can't really miss cholera. It's a very watery diarrhea. So like you can't, you know, it's not as if the impact of a cold or the flu or gonorrhea is very physically present. Like you can't see it. You're not going to be walking around the street with people looking at you going, oh, you're really ill. Maybe things like measles and mumps is a bit more obvious because you've got rashes and things. But typically, if you can't see it, nobody cares. And that allows disease to become endemic in the UK here, because a lot of our disease isn't outwardly presenting in a sort of, I don't want to say the word terrifying, but terrifying way, you know, like people vomiting, projectile vomiting, stuff like that. It's not, you know, a lot of that doesn't happen. And then there's also the education aspect. You know, we're taught before coronavirus. You were taught to wash your hands before coronavirus. I'm just putting that out there. Everyone was taught to wash their hands. And in a lot of hospital settings, there's, you know, consciousness on antimicrobial resistance. So making sure we're not over-prescribing medications. There's education of nurses to look out for symptoms of MRSA and things like that, hospital infections that could be passed on to other immunocompromised patients. So in the UK, our hygiene education is really good. If people listen or not is another matter, but we're definitely taught all those things. I wondered if you had any other thoughts on why we might not have more obvious endemic disease in the UK.
I'm not sure because I wasn't aware, I suppose, that we had fewer than some other places.
Mm-hmm.
At least other places that are similar economically to us.
Mm.
And I also wouldn't have necessarily described our education on hygiene and such as that good, but I suppose, on the whole, it's presumably very good.
Yeah.
I
mean, so norovirus is probably, I think, is quite a good one for this. So, like food poisoning type illnesses.
Right.
Can you think of how they're prevented in the UK?
I mean, there's high standards for sort of restaurants and places like that sell food. And we don't have so much, we don't have quite so many like outdoor sort of food vendors. Like we have some, but they're in specific places. You'll find them in like Camden or for specific markets and things, but you don't have so much. Like it isn't sort of the default way that everyone gets food. So I guess it's fewer of those mean there's going to be fewer diseases. Like you're not so likely to have food kind of left in the sun and that's sort of getting infected by things outside, but also the few that we do have are then also pretty well regulated.
Right. We have like the food hygiene standards and that kind of stuff. Yeah. So.
And I guess like our sort of water sanitation and stuff like that are very good.
Yes, exactly. So we have a lot of, I mean, we suffered for it back in the 1800s when we didn't. So we learned our lesson pretty quick that if you dump stuff into a river and then drink that water, you're going to get ill. So it's those kind of having infrastructure, having hospitals that have people in it that know what your resources are in terms of hygiene and things like that. So yeah, I would say that a lot of the endemic disease in the UK is stuff you've probably heard of, but not necessarily something that you'd think was very dangerous in a way that means we can't treat it. I mean, some of the diseases, especially for people with HIV, can be fatal without hospital intervention, but that doesn't mean they won't die from it. They're just at an increased risk of having worse impacts from the disease. So the kind of diseases that maybe aren't publicized as much are typically endemic diseases because they exist continually. And as we've seen in the media can't keep up with something that exists continually. They just lose interest and it's not exciting anymore. So I've got a very long list of examples of ones that I think are either endemic or very consistent in the increase of infections. And I was talking about this with Chi-Chi, who also microbiology degree holder, and we were discussing the ins and outs of what defines something as endemic. So the top 5 are ones that are very important to the UK to make sure we keep track of and make sure that we understand where the numbers are coming from. So like what populations are getting sick, what areas of the country are getting sick, so that then precautions can be put in place. And then slightly lower down are things like meningitis, which see spikes on university campuses. But there is suitable vaccines for that. So although it does exist and it does circulate in the population because it lives behind your nose, so you might not be sick, but the meningitis does continue to infect people from you. And then there's also the presence of tick-borne diseases like Lyme disease and sexually transmitted diseases like HPV and herpes virus. Again, HPV we vaccinate against, and we've talked about that. An interesting one that I do want to point out is chickenpox. A lot of countries vaccinate against chickenpox, but that's not what we do in the UK. In the UK, we just let people get chickenpox, and that actually has quite an impact. I wondered if you had any thoughts on, or any knowledge of, chickenpox in general.
Not really any knowledge beyond that supposedly you can only get it once, but my mum had it multiple times as a kid, so that's not necessarily always true. And that isn't that generally what we say, is that a kid gets chickenpox, they'll be off school for a bit and then they'll be fine and they won't get it again, so we just don't worry about it.
Right.
Fine, as long as there isn't some other condition that's going to make that dangerous to you. And given that we tend to get it as children, you might not always know that yet. Like, you could have something as a kid, and if that's the first serious, if there's the first thing you get that isn't like, that's worse than a common cold, and it turns out that it's going to be dangerous for you, you don't know that yet. Yeah, so that's concerning.
Yeah. Well, and also what people don't really think about is the fact that if you have chickenpox early on, it can lead to you developing shingles later in life.
What?
So chickenpox and shingles are the same virus. I realise this is in the bacteria section, but I apologise. But yeah, the chickenpox virus, which is varicella zoster virus, I believe, is the same virus that causes shingles. So if you have chickenpox, the virus hangs out in your nerves for like 50 years and then comes back and is like, surprise, it's shingles.
What the hell?
Because you're immunocompromised potentially as you get older. So then you get shingles. So to me, it's always baffled. It's always baffled that there would be anyone who's willing to have chickenpox because it turns into shingles later in life.
But why isn't that common knowledge?
I couldn't tell you. It's common knowledge to me. So it's not going to be every person, but yeah, if you're immunocompromised, it increases your risk of having shingles later in life if you've had chickenpox. I can see you breathing very deeply in it. I think it might be anxiety. Okay, so besides this list having many things in the wrong places, let's change this.
Bear in mind they can't see the list, so I'm cutting out bits relating to the list that they can't see.
That's fine.
You're going to have to read this.
But the people watching the video will be able to see the list.
Yeah, fair.
So, okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit about specific examples of endemic disease in the UK. One that has now become close to my heart, I suppose, is one that I hadn't really heard about previous to a friend doing a lot of work on it, and also learning about sort of more veterinary pathogens, is tuberculosis. So tuberculosis, as we know, and as is controversially talked about, is common in badgers, and badgers can spread it to cows, and cows can spread it to people, and I think badgers might also be able to spread it to people. And all that to say, you're going to get TB, and it's highly infectious, very, very infectious. Air, mere particles of the virus need to be in the air for you to contract TB. And the thing that makes me mad is the fact that they no longer vaccinate for TB here in the UK. Baffling, truly. So basically, we had a case of tuberculosis in our school. Do you remember that? In high school?
No, I didn't know about that.
Yeah, there was a kid who had TB, and my mum called the GP and was like, I want to get my kids vaccinated for tuberculosis. That's the BCG vaccine, which causes, the big lump on your arm.
Okay, yeah.
then it falls off and it's a scar. And the GP was like, nah, we don't offer that now.
That doesn't make any sense.
Nope, doesn't make any sense
what's
whatsoever.
their reason?
I couldn't tell you. I actually don't really know why they would stop vaccinating. Presumably because we're not an at-risk population, quote unquote. Populations that are at risk are typically intravenous drug users and homeless people, because of the supposedly lack of hygiene and close quarters. But that came from a government document, and it showed that the numbers of intravenous drug users stayed the same and the tuberculosis cases increased. So I put my scientific critical eye on and said, don't know how I feel about these conclusions, but tuberculosis is still around, and I'm going to show a map and I'll describe the map for the people listening. But currently, the incidence of tuberculosis is decreasing, which is good. The measures that the government are implementing are decreasing the number of cases. And people who have HIV are particularly susceptible to tuberculosis because tuberculosis is a latent condition. Do you remember that? Do you remember when we talked about that? So latency is the virus exists in your bod for an infinite amount of time. It just hangs out in your body, hidden from the immune system. So if you have latent TB, it hangs out in your liver, lungs. It hangs out everywhere. I'm pretty sure it hangs out everywhere. It forms these little nodes, and the virus is in the middle, and then it has all the immune cells around the outside, and it forms like a bubble around it, and it protects it. So it can hang out in your body, and then occasionally it will be reactivated, and then you'll have an active case of TB. And at that point, you would go and have 6 months of 4 different antiviral drugs pumped into your body, because that's the only treatment. But it's successful treatment, it's just a long treatment. So for HIV positive people, getting tuberculosis is super, super risky because they don't have the immune system to protect them and to force the HIV into that little bubble, and to force the tuberculosis into that little bubble. So the tuberculosis just runs rampant and does its thing out in the open. It doesn't get pushed into latency, basically. So technically latency could be seen as a protective mechanism, but it does mean that you would get reoccurring infections potentially. So
it's so weird that the government doesn't consider TB worth vaccinating against, because anybody could get HIV at some point in their life, and frankly anyone could become homeless at some point in their life.
Yeah.
So like, why do we consider that? Why do we sort of go, oh, if you've got HIV or TB, good luck, I guess. I mean, if you've got HIV or if you're homeless, good luck, I guess.
Right.
But not consider or not care about people who could end up in either of those categories later in life. That
yeah,
doesn't
totally.
make sense.
No, and it doesn't, because I think one of the reasons that they give is that when you have the BCG, the vaccine, if you were suspected to have TB and they tested you, you would always come back positive, and it could be a false positive because the vaccine reacts as if it's an actual infection. So the way that we test for TB and the way that your immune system fights TB are the same. So usually we might test viral load, or we might test a protein that is produced only when you have an active infection, or you might test the genetics of the disease that you've got. We can't do any of that for TB. At the moment, we just test to see if there's presence of TB in your body. And bearing in mind, this is bovine tuberculosis. There are like a bunch of different types. So when you're vaccinated, you're effectively introducing that into your body, so your body knows how to fight it, which is great. But in terms of public health and epidemiology, if you're going to test a bunch of people to see if they have tuberculosis, the people who are vaccinated will come back positive. It's also why it's difficult. Go ahead.
I see the issue, but I feel like at least some of that can be mitigated by keeping a record of who's had the vaccine.
But just because you've had the vaccine doesn't mean it's worked.
Yeah, I suppose that's true.
So you could have active infection and then you'd spend all that money for 6 months treating them when actually it was just the vaccine that they had.
That's fair. I see the issue, but I do think... I don't think that just saying, whatever, we just won't vaccinate people is the right way to deal with that.
No, definitely not. And I would say
no expert, but...
Okay. I would say that genome sequencing now hopefully means that we can become better at identifying tuberculosis, because I'm thinking that the inactive form of TB in the BCG vaccine is genetically different to a live infection. I don't know if that's true. I'll look it up and put a link to any information that I find. But now that I think about it, genetic sequencing could have a good impact, and therefore we could vaccinate everybody, which is what we want. So incidence of TB in the general population is going down. It's also staying the same in HIV positive populations. But even though it is reduced somewhat, it's still in areas of the UK, which, let me move this over here, which means that, I can't, never mind. So it does have a huge impact in the UK still, because there are plenty of areas in the UK that can experience TB. So if you look at the map for people on the video, so me and Esmé are looking at a map that is showing England and Wales in lovely pretty colours, and the east coast of the UK, from the border of Scotland all the way down to Kent, is, testing my English geography, is green. All the counties along that edge are green, which means they are a low risk area for tuberculosis. And then as you get further west, the risk increases, and places like Cornwall, Devon, and the border between England and Wales, it becomes a much more high risk area. That means that typically there are animals and humans there that have TB. And then obviously between those two areas of low risk and high risk, there's a sort of edge area, as they call it, and they see cases either every 6 months or annually. So it's not regular cases necessarily, but there are still cases there. We don't have any information for Scotland, but Wales does see quite a lot of high tuberculosis incidence. So overall, the UK has TB. A fair amount of TB, to be fair. So who's vulnerable? It has a huge impact on the world. Lots of people in the world will have tuberculosis in their lifetime. I think it's a quarter of the world's population. Yeah. A quarter of the world's population has latent TB, at least, which means they have TB and then it can re-emerge, or it can reactivate and become a live infection. And a lot of times, children are very vulnerable to TB because they've got little baby weak immune systems. But once you have it as a child, you're going to have it forever unless you get treated with antibiotics. 6 months of antibiotics. And don't forget, antibiotic resistance is a thing. So it is important to note that there is highly resistant versions of tuberculosis.
Did you say 6 months of antibiotics?
Yeah, 6 months of 4 different antibiotics. all at one time.
God.
It's a very difficult illness to treat, but it is completely curable. You can cure it.
Right.
But yeah, so you can get it as a child, and maybe you'd have a little bit of a cough and you wouldn't know it was TB. And then it would become a latent infection. And then when you're older, maybe you get quite sick with something else. You get HIV. You know, there's some other vulnerable situation that you're in. And then the TB rises back up and says, I'm here, guys. Here I am infecting people. So children typically are vulnerable in the first place, and then they can have a latent infection for the rest of their life. That's how a quarter of the world population has a latent infection, because people get a little cough when they're a kid, and it becomes later in life you realize that it was TB that you had way back when.
That's horrifying.
Yeah, but it's the world we live in. We have to coexist with these microorganisms. So as I said, it's very infectious, and you can be infected and not be ill. So again, that adds to the latent infection aspect of you could get infected and it would be latent for a while, and then you'd suddenly have TB, and everyone will be like, where did you get TB from? Who knows? Because you've had it for 10 years and now all of a sudden it's re-emerged. It typically presents with cough and fever and night sweats. We love a good night sweat. But it's advised that if you're a vulnerable person, you would go to the hospital. I don't know what you would do if you are not a vulnerable person. I would say self-isolate, but we all know that that's a newfangled thing for the current climate. So, you know, maybe you'd think that you've just got a cold because you've got a cough and a little bit of a fever, maybe the flu, mild form of the flu, and then you go to work and then you spread it to all your pals. So I can see Esmé has a very stressed face right now. So we're going to keep moving on to the treatment success rate. This is a good thing. We're very, very, very lucky that the treatment success rate is almost 100%. I say it's well for new and relapse cases. So don't forget, sometimes even if you treat, it can become latent, but a lot of times it's when you've got a live infection, if you get treated, it will be gone over 75% of the time, which is pretty good. There is also forms of TB, as I said, that are highly drug resistant. So there's forms that are MDR or RRTB. So they're resistant to a specific subset of antimicrobials. The ability to recover from that, the ability to get treated if you've got a resistant form of TB is still increasing. We're still following a similar curve to the people who are just getting treated normally. It just means you can't use that subset of drugs. You'd have to use a different one. However, what is known as XDR, or the completely resistant to everything TB, that's X drug resistant, so everything drug resistant. It's kind of seeing some spikes and troughs. It's very hard to predict how the treatment is going to be, whether the treatment is going to be as successful. As of sort of 2016, it's just below 50%. And that's an increase from about 2011, where the chance of treatment success was 0%. So we are gradually improving our ability to sort of, if you imagine the 4 drugs that we're using to treat, for a regular person, for a person without resistant TB, those 4 drugs are great. You just use them, person gets better, and that's it. The next layer is someone is resistant to drug A. So we have to look in our catalogue and see which drugs can replace drug A and do the same thing as drug A, but isn't a TB resistance drug. So you'd swap out A for something else. And, you know, as you can see, or as I've described, that's pretty effective. You know, it's just under 75% of people will see treatment success. The issue comes when all 4 of those drugs, A, B, C, and D, the patient is completely resistant to, and so you have to swap out every single drug for something else. And it's not even just a drug, any old drug. It's got to do the same job, and it cannot be the same class of drug. So we have different classes of antibiotics, and typically a class of antibiotics has the same function or role. So if there's resistance to a class of drugs, you're kind of losing out on that role, that impact of that antibiotic. So that's why resistant TB, fully resistant TB, can be very difficult to treat, is because there's only so many drugs that you can swap in and out. You know, A can only be swapped so many times, B, so on and so forth. So if you're resistant to all the drugs, it can be very difficult to treat. But as we are seeing, there is an increase in the treatment success rate. As I said, 2010, 2011, I say 2011, 2012, maybe 0% treatment success rate. 2015, 2016 went from 25% to about 40%. So we are seeing an increase. And there's actually a reason for that, is that TB now, when you get tested, they also test the type of TB that you have, aka its resistance profile. So they determine whether your TB is there, whether you have TB, and then also whether your TB is drug resistant, and then they can cater that profile for you as an individual.
So how do they do that then? Like, how do they know?
I think they run a very specific assay. I think there's, from what I remember, there's a machine that you can cough into. So you have a cartridge and you can cough into it, and then you close it up and you put it in a machine, and the machine analyzes all the particles and the sputum, and then it tells you this is the TB that you have, or whether you have TB, and then this is its resistance profile. The technology itself, I can't recall if it's like patented, you know, like it's not free for everybody to use and develop themselves. I think there's a company that actually does that specifically, because you always got to get money from sick people or make money off of sick people.
Oh man.
Mm-hmm. So there is a way to tell the resistance profile, and usually if you did it by hand, you would grow the bacteria on a plate, and then you would take a little bit of that and you would streak it on a new plate and put some little antimicrobial discs, so discs soaked in different drugs. And then if the bacteria doesn't grow close to if there's a ring around the disc of no growth, then it's sensitive to that drug. The drug has killed that bacteria in that area or stopped it from growing in that area, which means it's an effective treatment. If growth just carries on throughout the plate, ignoring the disc, then you can see the bacteria doesn't care about that drug. The drug doesn't do anything to that bacteria. The problem with TB is it takes a very long time to grow, up to 6 months, in fact. It's very difficult to grow in lab conditions. So while you're waiting for it to grow, someone already has TB and is going and walking around and interacting with people and spreading that tuberculosis. So they've had to come up with sort of new ways of doing that. And obviously I've said genome sequencing is helping a lot with that, because you can look at the gene profile, but only if you know what to look for in the gene profile. We know what the gene is for a certain resistance to an antibiotic. to an antiviral, whatever. We have that knowledge. We know what the gene profile markers for TB are. We don't necessarily know what their variations are. So you can have like the general markers, you know, like how do you know a person is a person? Because they have features of a person. But you don't necessarily know what that person's sexual orientation is from their genetics, or that person's opinion on schooling. You know, it becomes a lot more difficult to determine gene variants of things when there's so many variants that you know, we just don't have that knowledge, and people are researching that knowledge, but it's slow going, especially because tuberculosis is endemic, therefore deemed maybe not as urgent to research as some other diseases. So they've deemed the 6-month full antimicrobial drug treatment as satisfactory for people to recover, and therefore the risk is low, in the opinion of the governing bodies. Mm-hmm. So how long have I been talking for? Just under an hour? What time did we start? I didn't look. Okay, I'll talk for a little bit longer then. So I do want to touch on HIV a little bit. So tuberculosis obviously is a really big one because it's something that we don't necessarily hear about. I mean, have you heard about TB being an endemic disease or a disease of note in the population?
You froze for a minute there.
Oh, there we go. I can hear you now. Yeah, so have you heard about TB being a disease of note in the population or not?
No.
Right, so that's why it's quite interesting, because, you know, commonly people don't really hear about it. However, we have heard about HIV. And overall, it has been stabilised in the population. And there are treatments for people to live a normal life. Your viral load will be so decreased that you can't transmit necessarily. It can't be picked up on an assay or on a test. So overall, HIV is becoming more manageable and under control. People can live normal lives. But, you know, there is that risk of immunocompromised situations where you pick up something else that could make you really sick. And there's also the stigma still around HIV. And again, like I say, the governing bodies have determined that it's endemic. I mean, another reason for HIV is you can't cure it. There is no cure. And there is no vaccine. So we just have to kind of let it be endemic because we can't do anything about it. So it lives inside immune cells. So if you start destroying immune cells with treatment, you're going to make yourself even more ill. So a lot of times we've just contented ourselves with sort of a, I don't know what we call it, like a treatment, but it doesn't cure. It just maintains your low viral status. One that is very important, which I really do want to talk about, is measles, mumps and rubella. I've talked about it before. Vaccinations. People aren't getting vaccinated and it makes me really angry because you're making others sick. So I think in the last year, the UK has lost its elimination status for measles, mumps and rubella. We no longer have our measles, mumps, rubella cases, in particular measles cases, under control. No more. Because there has been a sharp decrease in the number of people vaccinating their children and also getting booster vaccines and things like that. The threshold for number of people in the population or percentage of people in the population that are vaccinated is 95% for MMR in general. It's a bit lower for rubella. It's a bit higher for measles, I believe. But on average, you want to get 95% of the population vaccinated so that you have, no risk of contracting it. 95%, as we've talked about for herd immunity, means that people who are susceptible to measles but can't get vaccinated will be protected. So if 95% of the population got immunised in England and Wales for measles, mumps and rubella, then they would be able to safely say, you are not going to catch measles or mumps or rubella. And that will protect the people who can't get vaccinated. So symptoms include, for all three, high temperature or fever. For measles and rubella, you see a rash. In mumps, you see swollen salivary glands. So it makes you look like you have a sort of distended, swollen neck. Nausea is common for mumps. Measles is common, has a runny nose as a common symptom. And rubella has sore throat. So as you can see, they're kind of all cold and flu symptoms as well. A lot of similar symptoms to diseases that people have deemed acceptable, which is interesting to note. But the fact that, I need to phrase this carefully, when you vaccinate, you see a decrease in the number of cases, and you see improvement in the population in terms of protection from that illness, right? You see an improvement in the number of people getting sick. There's no longer as many people getting sick. And public perception says people are no longer getting sick. Therefore, we don't need to worry about it anymore. When we stop worrying about diseases like this, we no longer vaccinate. And when we no longer vaccinate, surprise, surprise, those diseases come back. Just because we're vaccinating against it doesn't mean that it's going to be eradicated. It doesn't mean it's certain that it's going to be eradicated. It takes a lot more work than just, we're going to vaccinate to eradicate a disease. And then there's also the issues with sort of a resurgence in anti-vax movement type situations, which means that if you send your kid to school, they are going to be susceptible to catching measles, mumps or rubella, and they will also then pass that on to other people. We're back to that. Are you willing to take the risk for yourself is the wrong question. Are you willing to take the risk for somebody else? The right question. You may have a mild form of measles, but if you're going to pass that on to somebody who can't fight it off, who couldn't be vaccinated. And my prime story example is there was a news report that said that someone who hadn't vaccinated their child got measles, they went to the GP, and in the waiting room there was a baby who hadn't been vaccinated yet because they're a baby. Newborn babies don't really get vaccinated until they're a few years old. And that baby caught measles and died. Okay, that person, that parent brought their child to the GP because their child was sick. Right thing to do. But that child had measles because they hadn't been vaccinated, and it ended up killing somebody else. So it's not that you should feel bad for not vaccinating your child. You need to assess what is right for your child, but you need to be aware of the implications of not vaccinating and taking your child to public places, sending them to school, sending them to the hospital, because a lot of times the people in GP surgeries and hospitals are vulnerable. But yeah, so we've lost our elimination status of MMR. And there's a quote here that says, nearly half of the mumps cases this quarter were unvaccinated. So there are still people getting mumps who have been vaccinated. It's, you know, it's going to happen just from the nature of vaccinations. They're not 100%. But the fact that half of the mumps cases were people who were unvaccinated shows that there is, you know, there is an ability to reduce that number. It's also tricky because we're not taught about boosters as much as you would think we would need to be. I think something like the MMR only lasts like 10 or so years. You know, it lasts like maybe 12 years maximum. So really, as adults, we should be getting boosters all the time. But you don't really hear about that. I don't know, have you heard about like getting boosters in adult life?
Definitely not. Like, I can tell you more about the history of vaccination than I can about anything going on now, because that's what we were taught in school.
Right.
And I can't even remember which vaccine it is that you're supposed to get either before you get to university or
Meningitis,
when you
I
get
think.
there. Right. They kind of, like, certainly where I was, you know, there was a whole campaign encouraging us to get it, and then it was very difficult to actually get it. Like,
yeah,
it was like, oh yeah, he just come to this, come sign up at this on this table, and the table was there for like 2 hours during lecture time. Like, you know,
mad.
and certainly when it comes to the boosters and stuff, I'm not sure which ones I'm supposed to have had at this age. I'm not sure, because it's the thing that, you know, your parents do it up until a certain age, or, you
And
know,
then
you
it's just, yeah, forgotten about.
Yeah, and no one sort of mentions it, no one tells you. We have all these public health campaigns about all kinds of other things
for children, yeah.
Yeah, stuff directed at parents, stuff about nutrition and diet and all that sort of thing. And they don't, I don't know, like, you don't, it sounds silly because obviously the answer is, well, you should be educating yourself. The information is out there, go look for it. But you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah,
it takes
true.
someone telling you there's this information that you're missing for you to know to go look for it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as well in the science community as well, there is some kind of level of gatekeeping in terms of the general public and scientists. Some scientists really think that their research is so important that the common person doesn't, like, would never understand, which is complete and utter rubbish. Like, I have a degree.
It here. You're telling me this stuff and I'm understanding. You just need to explain it in a way a layperson can get.
Right, exactly. And a skill, a pure, like a skill that could be cultivated is being able to explain things that you have knowledge of at different levels. That is a skill. And if
not everyone has to do it, but as long the important information needs to get out there.
Right, exactly. And protecting that information from common people and not helping the lay people, you know, understand what you're doing is, it doesn't just, I don't know what word you would use, but it doesn't just discredit you as a scientist. You know, like, you're doing your scientific work, you're in the community, people know what you're doing. It doesn't just do you an injustice that people don't know about your research. It also does the people that it impacts injustice, I think. You know, you can't think that your work has meaning unless you're making sure that everyone it's intended for understands what is going on. But yeah, so it is important, I think, and I've done this recently, is to have your vaccination records. You can ask for them from your GP, and then you can see when you were vaccinated and what you were vaccinated with. And then you can look up, you know, MMR boosters for adults and see whether you need to have a booster. It's the same with other vaccinations that you would have as a child. You can look up the name of the vaccine or the name of the disease that it's vaccinating for, and, you know, see if you need a booster. And there's also, you know, when you travel, you're meant to look up vaccines that you're meant to have. There's all sorts of vaccinations that you need if you go to other countries. It's the same thing here. If you're staying in your own country, you need to make sure that you're protected, not just for yourself, as we're back to, not just for yourself. It's not just for you. Don't care if you don't care, but do you care about other people? So yes, the endemic diseases have more of an impact than one might think in the UK, but there is a whole long list of endemic diseases. You can also type in to Google things like emerging diseases in the UK and see a long list. But yeah, I wondered if you had any closing thoughts. We definitely covered a lot of viruses and bacteria, but there are also fungal infections, again, for HIV sufferers or HIV people with HIV. It's very dangerous to get fungal infection because it's compromising your immune system again. And then also, we're not the only ones that have endemic diseases in our population. Animals do too. And
we should do a whole episode sometime on animal diseases.
We should. Animal diseases, very, very broad and interesting. I did a module for my final year on veterinary pathogens that have an impact on human health. So it's very important to know about all these thingies, and just, I think having just even a little tiny bit of awareness and context helps to understand so many other aspects of microbiology. And I hope that learning about endemic diseases of the UK has opened your eyes to what you might be missing, and encourage you to look into it or ask a question. You know, if you want me to talk about any other disease, I am willing to do that. I love talking about diseases and researching diseases. But yeah, so just to list again, to reiterate, just in case anyone does have any other questions about endemic diseases. Endemic diseases can include things like tuberculosis, HIV, measles, mumps, rubella, hepatitis C, MRSA, so that's a resistant form of Staphylococcus aureus, highly resistant gonorrhea. Gonorrhea is becoming a superbug in the community, which means that it is completely untreatable and raging through the communities in a lot of ways. Meningitis, there's forms of meningitis and encephalitis that have big impacts. COVID-19 is also potentially going to become endemic. Influenza of many varieties, there's lots of different types of influenza. At least one type is endemic in the UK. Herpes, HPV, chickenpox, and then other tick-borne diseases. There's looping ill disease, which I found on Google, which I thought had a very cool name and is apparently endemic in the UK, but I've never heard of it. So clearly that needs to be talked about more. And then veterinary diseases, such as diseases that impact red squirrels, which obviously is a very important thing to consider because our poor baby red squirrels are under attack from all sides. So yes, any of those take your fancy, drop me a message. There'll also be a Q&A in a few days' time. So if you want to ask a question there, you can do that. But yes, Esmé, closing thoughts, closing question, anything?
How do you think we should go about educating the population on diseases like this and the importance of vaccinations and other, infrastructure and other like hygiene, all the things that will decrease their severity, decrease their impact? Bearing in mind it presumably has to start at a fairly young age without just terrifying everybody.
Yeah. I like the morbid and the scary. So obviously my take is always going to be a little bit morbid and a little bit scary because I like that drama. But you don't have to teach disease in a scary way. You don't have to teach awareness in a scary way. You don't have to scare people into believing you. And I think that's what a lot of institutions and governments miss, is that you don't have to frighten people. You just need to make them aware that what they're doing can be dangerous. So, like you say, education at a young age, very, very important. And I also think that, as I mentioned before, less gatekeeping in terms of who has the knowledge. You go to your doctor for knowledge. They don't know everything. Don't be afraid to question them and to you know, to bring up the fact, hey, this disease happens in the UK. Why aren't I getting vaccinated for it? What can I do to be safer? Because a GP's job isn't just to, you know, find out what's wrong with you. It's to direct you to resources that are going to help you understand this world that we're living in. Don't be afraid to ask people questions, ask scientists questions. I mean, I follow a huge number of scientists on Twitter and Instagram, and they're constantly posting about their research. If you're interested in the subject, the information is there. So maybe less teaching specific things and more teaching people to be proactive in their health. You know, they're like, oh, I'm not a doctor, so I wouldn't know. It doesn't matter if you're not a doctor. Sometimes the doctors get it wrong, and that's okay. They're just human beings. They're not gods. You know, we can't lift them up onto a pedestal. Sometimes you know what's best for your body, and sometimes you know what's best for your health. But you need to be informed, and you need to be proactive in finding that information. Like you say, you never would have thought to look up your vaccination records and see what vaccinations you needed boosters for. Like, don't be, I don't want to say the word lazy. Don't be shy about asking questions and finding out more. I also think that it would be very useful for doctors and surgeries and things like that to give you your medical records, or have like a digital version of your medical records that you can access whenever you want. So you can see your vaccination records, you can see your treatment history, you know, all the things of your health. It's back to that, you know, you go to a GP to get your problem fixed. You don't understand what the problem is. You don't understand what the treatment's doing. You just take the treatment and you hope it works. I don't think that's right. And you know, it's a similar thing in terms of people go to the doctors because they have a virus and they ask for medicine to get better. You know, that's not going to work. You don't get antibiotics for viruses. You get antibiotics for bacteria. We need to increase the transparency surrounding health, I think, overall. Don't know whether that would be effective, because there's still going to be people who just don't care or aren't invested, or see what they want to see and hear what they want to hear. They don't look for a balanced view. But it's still important that enough people are told and learn to be proactive, and to learn these sort of, in school you're taught less to question and more to listen. You need to question more, guys. Just ask questions, just be inquisitive, and we need to teach that, and we need to enforce that more than we need to enforce sit and listen and do your homework and then come into school and do that day after day, because it wears you down. So be curious. Just be curious, ask questions. I wonder if you have any thoughts. Let me flip it over to you. What do you think can be done?
I think I agree with you about teaching people to sort of take control of, like, you know, learning stuff for themselves and being informed. And I think there should be some level of scientific literacy that is greater than what we're taught in school, I think. I mean, you know, I remember being taught all of the sort of the terminology for how graphs work and that sort of thing. And I remember bits and pieces of it, not all of it. But like you said, it's very sit and listen. It's, here are the bullet points that you need to remember for the exam. And I don't feel like I would be able to sort of, the same way that with literature related stuff, I can go on to JSTOR or, you know, any other sort of, I can find academic articles on literary topics.
Yeah.
And I understand what's going on. I understand how to read them. I understand the, I understand how things are set out and how to make sense of them. I would not know how to do that with a scientific report.
Right.
Because I don't feel like I was ever, if I was ever taught, it was at an age where I've now forgotten it, or it was taught in a way that was focused on the exam, and so I, you know, got rid of that information after time.
Right, because I would say that reading a scientific article, finding a scientific article, you described how I would also go about it. You go onto the database or the website and you you scroll and you filter and you look for the topic that you're looking for in the same way. And maybe they're not written the same way, you know, the structure might be different, the language might be different, but you know, the basics are very similar. But because you were never told what database to look on, how would you ever know that it's there?
There's that, but there's also, and maybe this is just sort of a problem with a lot of people with arts and humanities kind of interests, is that I see a page full of numbers and graphs and I'm like, no.
I mean,
no,
I
no,
also
no.
do, but what you do when you read a scientific paper is you read the introduction and then you read the conclusion. Because to make a journal article, it has to be formatted in a very specific way. Your introduction has to contain a certain, you know, explanation of information. And we have introduction, methods, results, discussion, conclusion. So all these parts, it's very formulaic. And a lot of times you can ignore the methods because you're not going to be completing the methods. You can ignore the results because the results are summarized in the discussion. And so a lot of times you can read the discussion if you want that detail and those specific conclusions, but the summary of the discussion is the conclusion, and how they got to from the idea of I should do a paper on this to the conclusion is in the introduction. So introduction, conclusion, and then you're like, I want to know more about that. Read the discussion. See the numbers in the graphs? No, they can go. They can be gone. Don't even worry about them. Obviously, as a scientist, I do read the methods and results if I'm trying to determine whether this paper is reliable or not. But a lot of times, if it's peer reviewed, you would hope, that's a whole other discussion, you would hope that the peer reviewing process meant that it was very reliable.
And this is for the purposes of non-scientists.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, if you're going to also read a lot of papers for like a dissertation or something, what you would typically do is read introduction, read conclusion, or even just the conclusion in the abstract, so the bit that's taken to summarize the entire paper. And you would collate that into a database, and then you would go through, pick the most relevant ones, read them fully, understand them, see if they're appropriate to your research. Because you want to be broadly read but well read. So you're not going to read every paper that you come across that's related to your topic, unless of course it's a very, very niche topic. So you have to be efficient and smart. Actually, maybe I could talk about research papers and the research community, and
that would definitely be interesting.
Peer review and stuff like that, because I feel like knowing where your information comes from and how it's presented to you is very important in the science community. But anyway, that's a complete tangent. I think that, I think people need to want to take control of their education and their health. And not everyone wants to. So, yeah. What's coming up next? What's our next episode about? Do you know? Do you remember? I can maybe find it, actually.
Trying to make this not...
Yeah, here we are. It'll be this one. You want to go ahead and introduce and talk a little bit about it?
So our next episode is part 2 of our 2-part series on Tlon Ukpa Orbis Tertius. That's a short story by Borges, and we're looking at it in relation to stylistics, which is the application of linguistics to literature. So we'll be looking at speech and thought presentation and vocalization. So yeah.
It's very interactive, that episode. There's resources on a Google Drive, which I've linked at the end of the episode on my website. So if you want to pull those up and have a little look while we talk about the things, and Esmé asks me intense questions about things I don't know about, please do. Now we wait for Esmé to reconnect. And now we're back with Esmé. Froze again. Yeah, We both froze, I think. Yeah, so tune in for an interactive episode next time. Q&A will be out in a few days' time, so don't be afraid to ask some little questions. That will probably come out at the end of the month, so enjoy that. And speak to you all next time. Bye.
See ya.